Hey everybody, thanks for checking out my channel. I'm Russ, and this is the 80s are Russ. Having completed Echoes of Wisdom within about a week or so prior to recording this, it felt like about the right time to theorize about the game's official placement on this infamous Marvel multiverse of a timeline. So, with everything fresh in my mind, and given several in-game clues, I've accumulated what seems to me to be pretty solidifying evidence, at least enough to solidify my own headcanon timeline placement. But feel free to do what most Zelda fans do, and arguably what Nintendo wants us all to do until the end of time. Keep theorizing and come to your own conclusions. For me, until something irrefutably conflicting comes along and debunks my theory, the evidence of when Echoes of Wisdom occurs is overwhelming. And by the end of the game, my emotionally over-attached heart was swollen with an intense joy of recognition. A very familiar feeling kind of recognition, one that I vividly recall experiencing during my original playthrough of a specific Zelda game that holds a special place in my heart, The Wind Waker, which came out almost... Jesus fucking Christ, is that right? 22 years ago? Ugh, that literally just ruined my day. Anyway, you see, before the Breath of the Wild effectively one-noted them into being obnoxious little favor-mooching Deku scrub cousins, the Koroks were actually quite enjoyable. Introduced in The Wind Waker, which is easily one of my all-time favorites in the franchise, they were almost like less detestable minions that never spoke idiotic gibberish. They won me over with their stupid little blank stares, and so the realization that these whimsical, sorta lovable, sorta ugly little orphaned root babies were actually the spiritual remnants, or descendants of sorts, of the Kokiri children from Ocarina of Time. Woof. That shit right there. That's what I love about The Legend of Zelda. That feeling of discovery, not just in the way series creator Shigeru Miyamoto famously desired to impart upon players with the very creation of the original game, through exploration and puzzle solving, but through the story, or even more importantly, the legends woven throughout the story. Shigeru Miyamoto gets a pretty legendary bad rap for the stance he takes on story in the Legend of Zelda franchise. This is largely due to his less than subtle desire to distance the games from an obvious interconnected sequence, unless specifically implied by a sequel, prequel, or other such extension to a previously released game, all of which are traditionally pretty rare. It's wild to think about now, but by the time the canonical timeline was finally made available to the public in 2011, the IP was already a quarter-century old. My point is, these games have always been about the mystery, the legend, that intoxicating sense of discovery, the feeling of awe, and those goosebumps of recognition that bring so much feeling to the experience. The story isn't spelled out, it's not thrown in your face with excessive, overproduced cinematics that do little to differentiate themselves from the once very separate art of film. Not to knock flashy cinematics, I love those too, especially in my Zelda games. They can be wildly entertaining, but The Legend of Zelda isn't a film. The plot wasn't meant to be spelled out with beats based on a pre-written outline. It's about the characters and their interactions with each other, their combined histories in a mysterious land. It's about digging up clues from the past and following the breadcrumbs to your own vision of the events that took place in this ancient mystical kingdom. To be fair, sometimes the breadcrumbs are pretty big and can sorta nudge that vision in a certain direction. Breadcrumbs like the ones in The Wind Waker that led to my aforementioned epiphany about the Koroks, which turned out to be even more evident further into that game's events, but they still never technically spell it out for you, and I recall not everyone being in immediate agreement on this when I debated the game's implications with less enthusiastic friends at school who were still longing for trailer wish fulfillment. Just give it time, old friends. It's coming. So what's the point? What does this all have to do with Echoes of Wisdom? This isn't about The Wind Waker. Those games aren't even in the same branch of the timeline. Are they? Well, anyway, I was just illustrating a point about how Zelda games implement subtlety in their narratives rather than blatant connections with previously established lore. And even when they make blatant connections to established lore, it's never without a fair amount of wiggle room for the plot details between games. Usually enough wiggle room, in fact, to completely contain the narrative of each game, regardless of its connection to said prequels or sequels. And with all that in mind, I feel fully confident committing to the theory that Echoes of Wisdom is a prequel to the Minish Cap, by the customary few centuries or so. And just to be sure my vibe was on point, after I finished Echoes of Wisdom, with all the potential connections freshly forming in my brain while half memories of Minish Cap's plot rematerialized, I decided to continue directly into my first playthrough of the Minish Cap since its release. And wow, yeah, 20 years isn't as bad as 22, but man, this is getting depressing. What started as a fun romp through a nostalgic, charming, literally little adventure turned into a hunt for every scrap of side story I could deconstruct and fit into my expanding puzzle of the connective tissue between Echoes of Wisdom and the Minish Cap. The truth is, I thought it would be more of a wild goose chase without many revelations, but as I fumbled with ancient-feeling two-face button controls and the resulting near-constant item swapping, I realized I might actually be onto something. See, I figured I was probably imagining more of the connections than there really were, and it would ultimately feel really forced. You know, like trying to thread a frayed yarn through a needle. Some of the games barely feel like they fit in their own surrounding game's timeline after all. So I wouldn't be surprised if I was just grasping at straws. But in fact, the connections just kinda started lining up front and center. The more I played, the more things about this timeline placement felt like they were falling into place, filling in the nooks and crannies of mysteries I've wanted solved since their introduction in this 2 fucking decades old game. Still hurts. Firstly, I've always hoped for a game featuring the fabled hero of men. From ancient Minish lore, he's one of, if not the only hero of Hyrule that we don't ever personally play as, or even witness in-game. But beyond that, I've often pondered the origin of the pixel-sized Picori, the tiniest handful of Hylian humanoids. These borrower-esque individuals have connections to the Light Force, the Sacred Realm, and an ancient blade infused with evil rift repellent. I know they don't ever use the term rift in any of Minish Cap's lore drops, but come on. Swallowed by Shadow sounds an awful lot like this shit right here. And what about the primal energy-esque sounding golden light that the Picori supposedly brought to this hero of men, presumably named Link? Initially, one would assume they're referencing the Triforce, of courage or otherwise, but that's where any Triforce connections appear to end as far as the game is concerned, which is important to consider when you look at every other source of Triforce lore. The goddesses left behind the Triforce when they abandoned their beautiful ball of creation, which we now know condemned the world to a demonic pregnancy resulting in some gnarly stretch marks. Point being, it was never the Picori who brought the Triforce to Hyrule. But then, if the Picori are just some random race of Pikmin that are completely removed from traditional Triforce lore, where does their connection come in? What other golden light could it be? They clearly have a connection to the Sacred Realm as well, so it can't be a throwaway coincidence. And this is where you might decide I've lost my mind, but I honestly think the evidence is supportive enough to say that the Picori are descended from Tri and the other Nightlights in some way or another, but really, perhaps they're not even descended. Maybe in much the same way of the Koroks, once assuming humanoid forms in their guise of forest children, the Tris chose to become the ancient Minish after their time with Princess Zelda, who happens to herself be a prime example of a once deific being who chose mortal life to be closer to their loved ones. Yes, I believe Zelda's connection with Tri and their adorable interactions throughout the game are what inspire these bulbous, glowing party balloons to forego their golden light and eventually take form in the mortal realm, to be closer to their holy priestess and her goddess bloodline. Maybe this forest Minish elder even pretends this needle is a wizard's staff because it reminds them of a certain rod-wielding friend from centuries past. Probably not, but that's what headcanon is for. And then there's Link's sword. If Blueberry is a reliable narrator, we know he was technically the forger of Link's mighty blade, but while Tri's Force buddies didn't necessarily bring Link his Sword of Might directly, as would be depicted in later Minish lore, assuming all of this is on point, the thing was forged using crystalline byproduct of the Tri's magic, specifically where they had used it to seal rifts of shadow which were actively swallowing the world. Technically, it could have been Tri who informed Link of the crystal's potential for being bladified by Blueberry. I doubt Tri could have directly told Blueberry about the crystals because of another possible connection. Most people can't even see the Tri tribe. As with the Kokiri children, they're mystically hidden away from prying adult eyes. I know this isn't actually specified as a trait shared by the Kokiri in the games, but when they're not Koroks, they've chosen the form of children, who hide in the woods and appear to only interact with a really old tree. Anyway, regardless of similarities with the Kokiri or Koroks as far as we know at the start of the game, Zelda is the only one who can see the Trilights, likely due in part to her connection with the Prime Energy, but perhaps also because she's still young enough? We're never given a specific age at which a Hylian is deemed too old to see the Picori, so could there be a connection between the two? I think so. And I think that's why the Picori only ever appear to children of Hyrule. They share a connection with Tri, and by extension the Triforce and the Sacred Realm, and something about the innocence and purity of childhood allows the youth of Hyrule to witness these spiritual entities. And then there's the people inside the rifts, you know, the ones that get swallowed up and saved by the hero and or Zelda. Not just the ones who escape with the newfound ability to perceive invisible fat fireflies, but the ones who've been literally petrified, kind of like exactly what Vati does to Zelda and all the other castle-bound victims. Even the whole atmosphere of Dark Hyrule Castle gives major still world vibes, just without the Picasso geometry platforming. And while we're on Vati's magical bullshit, just look at what he does to the king. He pulls the old switcheroo and tosses Gustav Jr. into a broom closet. Holy shit, that looks a lot like an echo. Speaking of echoes, on full display in the Minish Cap, get ready. Boom. On top of all of this, even though it feels like a somewhat minor detail amidst all the echoing evidence, there's the wishing cap. Just about the most significant detail of the Triforce is its ability to grant wishes. The most valuable, non-specific magical power an object can even have. And these little nothing people can just whip up a wish-granting hat like some kind of last-second birthday gift card? A hat that has even fewer restrictions on its wish-granting than the Triforce? How? How did they do it? Unless they have access to the same power as the Triforce. A fun little side possibility offered by this theory is that maybe this is the living King Gustav, who eventually offers this Link some ghostly cryptic advice. But what about Ganon? They collectively interrogated. Yeah, I already thought about Ganon. It's only the most glaringly obvious potential hole in my theory. Except it isn't a hole at all. The existence of Demise is enough to explain it away without much further consideration, but let's get specific. Demise is canonically a previous incarnation of the evil that would ultimately become the Demon King Ganon. And while it's commonly assumed by much of the fanbase that Ganon is an evolution of Ganondorf upon acquiring the Triforce of Power, I'd argue that they're almost entirely separate entities. Almost. Like, sure. They're fused into one being by ritualistic magic and their mutual lust for power, with the occasional nudge by the Triforce. But Ganondorf, the Gerudo King, is basically the reincarnating vessel for Ganon, the Demon King, to possess. A willing host to the primordial evil that was cursed upon the goddess Hylia in the events of Skyward Sword. It's more of a name issue than anything, and they even have their demonic fusion interrupted by multiple other wannabe hosts. Or no host at all in the case of this climactic botched resurrection, which is more of a generally destructive force than the evil mastermind we love to hate. Turns out, without the Desert King's mind, the Demon King is quite calamitous. So Ganon's presence as a deific demonic force prior to Ganondorf's acquisition of the Triforce of Power, as seen in Ocarina of Time, is all but cemented by multiple sources in multiple games, about as canon as it gets. And he only exists as a reincarnated extension of Demise, whose own existence might originally stem from Null. So if his little more than a cameo appearance in Echoes of Wisdom is enough for you to get hung up on, I guess I'll just refer you to, to the rest of the convoluted timeline. According to Tears of the Kingdom's flashback events, Ocarina of Time doesn't even feature the earliest incarnation of Ganondorf's Gerudo form. This ties into my previous theory video about how the Downfall timeline connects with the other two timelines chronologically, or super chronologically, so be sure to check that out, but it also goes deeper than I did in that video. I'll have to elaborate on this in a future entry, but I believe this is the Ganondorf that plagued the events of the Downfall timeline to the point of decay that we see in the original NES game. The Ganondorf we see in Ocarina of Time is a reincarnated form that inherits the demonic possession from his Gerudo ancestor. But that's another topic for another presentation. Now I'm gonna get back to my replay of Skyward Sword and also the Four Swords to see if I can collect any more clues. Till next time, thanks for watching.